If some of you have visited my website, you see that I refer to myself as an advocate for radical care. And you deserve to know what I mean by that. What is radical care? I should begin by saying that today's capitalism, the neoliberal phase in particular, undermines care. So what neoliberalism values is individuals making rational decisions in the marketplace based on their own self-interest. And that is a quote. So care, as we know, is not something that's entirely rational. And it's certainly not based solely on self-interest. So we're living at a time, culturally, when care is actually discouraged. It's seen virtually as a weakness, as something that's not good for our brand or for being successful in the world. So the first reason I would call care radical is that it is care, and care of any kind is an act of subversion and resistance at a time when we're only valuing individual competition and success in the marketplace. So it's radical first for that reason. But of course I mean more by radical care than that. The second thing I mean by radical care, again referring back to today's dominant culture, what this form of capitalist culture values is positive affect. So we're all supposed to learn how to be happy, to be energetic, to be vital, even to be dramatic, because any attention is good attention. And so we value these things in ourselves, and we try to become managers of our own affect so that we're more positive in our attitudes. Well, radical care is radical because it does just the opposite. Radical care focuses on our sadness, our sorrow, our suffering, our pain. And this is something we're discouraged from doing in our time. Radical care focuses on our pain, and not just to relieve it, although it does want to do that. More importantly, radical care wants to learn from our suffering. What does our suffering have to say about the conditions in which we live in our time? So radical care goes against this grain that we always must be positive, that we always must be happy. But that's not all. There's a third thing about radical care that makes it radical. Radical care attends to a suffering that is not my own. It is not even limited to the suffering of people that are right around me that I care about, like friends and family, or people who are like me. Radical care attends to the suffering even of strangers, even of people different from me. As you noticed on my website, I'm a Christian minister and theologian, and I can think of no better illustration of what this means, this part of radical care, than a passage that is in the Christian writings known as the Gospels. And this is a passage where a young lawyer, it says, comes to Jesus, and he says to Jesus, "How might I inherit eternal life?" And Jesus asks him, "What does the law say?" And the lawyer answers in a way that both he and Jesus agree upon. He says, "The law says that we should love the Lord our God with all of our heart, mind, and strength, and our neighbor as ourselves." To which Jesus responds, "You have said rightly, do this, and you shall live." And then the lawyer asks the famous question, "And who is my neighbor?" Jesus' answer to that question is a parable for which he probably is best known, and that's the parable of the Good Samaritan. So Jesus tells a story in which a man is walking along the road and is mugged and is left in the ditch to die. And three people come by. First a priest, and passes by, does not stop to help the man. Then a Levite passes by. And the priest and the Levite represent people that in Jesus' audience are heroes. They are prized. Then a Samaritan passes by. Well, to Jesus' audience, the Samaritan was someone marginalized, someone despised, practically an enemy. And yet this is the man who stops to help and takes the wounded man to an inn and pays for his keep and pays for his care. So Jesus asks the man, after he tells the story, "Who do you think in the story proved himself to be a neighbor?" And the lawyer answers, "Him who showed mercy." Well, what is the takeaway from this story for radical care? Radical care has to do with the stranger, with prizing people and respecting and having compassion for those who are not only different, but may even be seen as our opposition, our competition, our oppressors even. And that makes care genuinely radical, especially for our time. I'll get to that. But first, my fourth point about what makes care genuinely radical. Radical care is always radical in a context, and I've mentioned this context before. Today's context puts an emphasis on personal responsibility. Radical care reverses the flow of who and what we think is responsible. And instead of blaming and shaming individuals, it encourages us to look at what is in the world that is causing people to suffer. So it reverses the role of responsibility. It's not that as individuals we're not complicit in our suffering. We often are complicit in our suffering. But this phase of capitalism causes us to radically overestimate our own power compared to, say, the power of global corporations and the alliances that are formed between large corporations and governments that control policies and so forth. We just don't have that kind of power. So the ultimate source of our suffering is not inside us, but is primarily outside us. So radical care reverses this flow and actually encourages us to take our depression, our anxiety, the feelings behind our addictions, and turn them out back into the world instead of pouring on them within ourselves in order to change the world, turn our depression back out into the world. Now, this is interesting because I should remark in passing that right-wing movements, right-wing political movements, both in the United States and around the world, have caught on to this. They've caught on to the fact that people are tired of blaming themselves. They're tired of blaming their suffering on themselves. They want to turn their suffering back out into the world. But what they do is they name other things in the external world that aren't actually the source of suffering. So we blame it on migrants, we blame it on racial minorities, we blame it on people that use welfare, we blame it on liberals, and so forth. This isn't the source of our suffering. The source of our suffering is the powers that I mentioned, the alliances between governments and large corporations that control our policies and increase economic, psychological, and relational inequality to unforeseen heights. This is the real source of most of our sufferings these days. So in this sense, we need to learn a lesson from the right-wing movements, except locate the problems that is the source of our pain in a different kind of externality. So we need to make our suffering more conscious by identifying its real sources out there in the world. And that, I think, is truly radical. And we need to stop being diverted by the manic entertainment preoccupations that our capitalist society is forcing on us these days. I can't think of anything more timely than radical care, this kind of radical care, at a time when our planet is engulfed with a global pandemic, at a time when our planet is literally burning up and environments are being degraded, at a time when the bonds between us have been dissolved and we need to come together again as a people. Radical care is care for our time, care for this time, care for you, and care for me. I plan to join in that kind of care, and I hope you will too.